Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Well, Quinn, how's it going, man?
Pretty good, you?
Good. Well, thanks for hopping on again.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a nice kind of warm day here in rainy Wake Forest. A good home base here. I wanted to get back together and talk to you about a topic we started to cover in a previous episode, and it was about declining social technologies.
Yeah.
I know this is a roundabout way. It's not exactly what we planned, but I think this plays in well. And so we talked about how, infant mortality definitely heading south, but at the same time, it feels like we've got a lot of declining capability in a lot of social arenas.
Yes.
That's perhaps a really poor way to put it. One of the big things we can think about is how often do people get married and form families?
Yes.
And this has been precipitously declining.
Yes.
Do you think that's a good metric for perhaps even?
Yeah. I think it's worth trying a bunch of different models to try get to the core thing. So I'm not proposing this is the fundament, the root difference.
Right.
But I think a decent one, if you're just trying different ones out, is that we're doing good at stuff that's very legible. Baby deaths.
Right.
We are not doing so good at stuff that's fuzzier and harder to quantify.
Interesting.
I'm seeing that pattern. And so marriages seem like a good metric, but we should expect there to be fewer good metrics. Because if we had good metrics, I think we'd be doing a much better job of...
Right. What's something that's fuzzy? Could fuzzy be something like...
community spirit, social trust to some extent, because we don't just mean do you trust other people, we mean should you trust other people, and that's hard to quantify.
Yeah, that is hard to quantify. So we talked about, you and I think have talked about the wallet studies where they drop wallets off in different parts of the world and see who, how often do you get them returned with money and things like that.
Yeah.
That seems like a good way to try and get at that, right?
Yeah.
To some extent.
I think so.
Gotcha. And just anecdotally, I would say I have this feeling, at least where we live, that people are pretty good to strangers in general.
Yes.
So I don't know if you've noticed this, but whenever I see someone break down by the side of the road, very often I'll see someone else, unrelated, stop and try to help. This happened to my wife recently, she's driving far out in eastern North Carolina, has a flat tire or something. Something was wrong with the car. And, someone just pulled up behind her. It's do you need help? I'm happy to help, and just gets out and helps her put things together. So in some sense, go ahead.
I just yesterday saw someone on Twitter saying, reiterating that he was waiting for a bus in the rain, and a woman pulled up in her car and asked if he wanted to get in where it was warm. Because, it was raining. And the bus was actually behind her, so she was holding it up. But he was saying he said, I love this town.
Yeah. No, that's a really good metric. And even if you're able to talk to people.
Yeah.
I think in line in the grocery store, that's a really good sign, just to be able to talk about whatever or be generally friendly to people you have no relation to.
Yeah, you don't have a baseline expectation that they'll hurt you.
Right.
That helps a lot.
I think that's really positive.
Yeah.
So at least locally, things are in some sense okay.
Yeah.
Or they still work okay, and more so than in other parts of the world, I feel like.
Yeah.
But that could be very well localized to our area. Now, marriage. Get back to marriage. This, we're jumping around a little bit, but I think we can tie it back together really well. Marriage rates. So the book we started talking about is called Coming Apart.
Yeah.
And the thesis, it's called Coming Apart: The State of White America from 1960 to 2010.
Yeah.
And the author focuses on white America to kind of just give us a subsection.
Yeah.
It's a big demographic, and it gives us some idea of like how things have changed over time.
And he says that people always sort of try to make this stuff about race.
Yeah.
So just focusing on white America makes that very, very difficult. If he's going to talk about an underclass forming, and he's just talking about white people, people can't go, but yes, that's Jim Crow.
Right, exactly.
We're talking about Jim Crow.
Right. So you can't subsect it by in some other way.
Yeah.
Other than it has to be class.
Yeah.
To some extent. That's super interesting.
I would call it he's controlling for a confounder.
Right. He's controlling for a confounder in this case. So this is the book. There's kind of this great divergence between, what would he call it? Like, I guess between, upper class.
Yes.
And then lower class.
Yes. Smart, college-educated people who tend to be affluent. But It's partly social class. So money is a very incomplete metric of it.
Gotcha. So we could think of like a PhD student in sociology at Duke probably does not have a lot of money.
Yep.
Probably makes 20, 30K a year or something like
yes.
that. But they are class in terms of class.
In particular, I think that a lot of people in the upper class trade off money against other things they want more. So I would definitely put at least some journalists in the upper class. And they don't get paid very well in money, but they get paid pretty well in influence and in
status or race status or something like that.
Status too, yeah. Since that their work is meaningful, the ability to exercise power.
Yeah.
So I think just that's another reason why money doesn't map it completely.
Right.
Bertrand Russell has a really good essay where he distinguishes, he's talking about motivations, and he distinguishes the love of glory from the love of power. And he says, he's writing in 1952, I think. He says, in America, movie stars have glory, and the House Un-American Activities Committee has power, but no glory. And he says that actually you see this pretty common historical figure who has no glory whatsoever, no status whatsoever, goes about in rags, but controls everything, sort of a power behind the throne figure. And he cites various examples. And I've run into that places beside Bertrand Russell, so I think it's a thing. To the extent that money is part of a total compensation package, you should expect to see people using it as a dump stat sometimes to maximize other stuff. Gotcha.
Interesting. Huh. So do you mean something where like, what do you mean by that? What's a dump stat? Sorry.
In certain games, I think Dungeons and Dragons maybe, definitely a bunch of clones of it. You have a certain number of points to distribute between attributes.
Gotcha.
So strength is an attribute, intelligence is an attribute. You can take points from strength and put them into intelligence, which will make you smarter but physically weaker. Scott Alexander has a pretty amusing retelling of the Greek myths where he uses this logic explicitly to explain why Hercules is incredibly stupid, because he's also the strongest man in the world, so he's put all his points into.
Nice.
Which is why I think of when I think of the... So when people are designing characters to play the games, a lot of the times they'll decide that a particular stat just doesn't matter much.
Gotcha.
They might not put any points into charisma because I'm just going to bash people over the head.
Right.
They call that a dump stat, a stat where you don't care how low it is, so you can distribute the points to your other attributes.
Gotcha.
So if you were maximizing for influence, you might end up with relatively little money, because anytime you have a chance to trade money for more influence, you'd take it. Gotcha.
And probably there's something where, like, each profession or job has like some trade-off between all these different factors.
Yeah.
And you try and each person's trying to optimize on it. So maybe if you get more status, you get less money or something like that. And
yes.
Gotcha. Interesting. One of my pet projects is I want to do when I'm 70 is write this big sociology of American class.
That would be neat. I would read
it. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting, right? Like you go live with all kinds of different people, and like try and like ferret these things out. Like Paul Fussell wrote some kind fairly tongue in cheek, which I wish he was actually more literal all the time. I think it'd be.
I read Scott's Review, which Scott's reviews tend to quote big sections of the original text, so I end up feeling like I've read Fussell.
Yeah, it's good. It's funny. It's really entertaining. So this divergence between kind of upper class whites and I hate to say lower class. It makes things sound bad. I wish I had some other term.
Yeah, I know.
But lower class whites, shall we say? And there is this like it's almost taboo to talk about class in the U.S., right? Like so, there's no such thing as class.
It's awkward.
Yeah,
and people redirect it into discussions about money.
Right, and then we start talking exactly.
Like it gets auto-translated.
Right. All the time. Like there's no such thing. And it's funny because I think actually one of the things I got from the book was like, I think this was it was somewhat true that there was very little class in 1960 among whites in America.
Lots of mobility. I noticed that. And lots of people not identifying with a particular class. And he makes the point that they might be rationally expecting to change classes because that happened a lot more often back then.
Right. The example I like to give is, and he gives in the book, is in 1960, Maytag, this huge American company that still makes washing machines, based in some small town in Iowa.
Yeah.
And the neighborhood where the CEO and chairman, founder of Maytag lived, his house was only like 1.5 times the median house in the town.
Yeah.
And all kinds of people lived in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And that is somewhat unthinkable today to think, so what's a great American company? New great American company, like Apple, Can you imagine Tim Cook living with,
Nah.
in a house that's 1.5 times the median? Well,
he would get a reputation for being an eccentric.
Yes, we would think it was very weird.
Yeah.
He wouldn't. He'd be living in like Cary in one of these big neighborhoods. Not with everyone else. Just an example for North Carolina. But so things have gotten very different now, right? Like even in that example, the CEO of Maytag now, he lives in Des Moines.
Yes.
In Iowa, in a really rich suburb, and then like takes his private jet down to the headquarters every day or something like that. And so I guess my question is, and maybe we haven't painted this divergence super well yet, and maybe we should do that first.
Yeah.
But why did things diverge like this, right? Like between, there used to be things were really flat, like fairly flat.
Well, I've read a few different people. I mean, Murray now, but also Paul Graham, and I read Zvi's review and analysis of Tyler Cowen's Complacent Class, which seems like it's talking about the same stuff.
Yeah.
Graham thinks that things were artificially pushed close together, largely because of World War II. That World War II put us on a war footing, which is essentially socialist, command and control, top down.
Right.
And that we inherited these huge corporations that didn't really compete with each other and didn't really have to worry too much about going out of business.
Gotcha.
This sort of fake economy. I think he calls it the Duplo economy there.
Oh, interesting.
And that we have all these weird social mores, I guess, in those that you recognize from the military, like seniority being really important.
Yeah.
And like working the same place for your whole life.
Yeah.
And not trying to get market price for your labor because you're going to be there. That all makes sense in a, military structure.
Yeah.
And it's just weird in a market structure.
Right. And
I guess eventually that stopped working and we decompressed.
Yeah.
Which, good parts and bad parts to that. Definitely it's worth focusing on the bad parts, I think.
Right. Well, on the positive side, what have we gotten? We've gotten like consumer goods are a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
Generally, like TVs.
Yes.
A lot cheaper.
Consumer goods are cheaper. There's the whole information technology.
Yeah.
It's a little hard to untangle because it's also a cause, but I was a teenager. There was this guy I watched movies with every so often, and I had to be careful not to bring up his religion or he'd get mad. I didn't have friends. I was in a world that wasn't really very connected, and so
it was like coinciding with consumer internet coming online, I guess.
Yeah. 2000s.
Gotcha.
And partly I was less functional. I'm autism spectrum, and I had learned less about, how to relate to other people. But also, I noticed it reading Murray's book. He's talking about smart, isolated people who would find ways to connect with the normal people in the football team. If you were the nerd who wants to read physics books, but there aren't any other nerds who want to read physics books, then you will find ways to relate to the non-physics reading people.
Right. You're kind of jammed into fitting in.
And sometimes it just doesn't work. I mean, I was incredibly depressed as a teenager. I'm not totally sure about the etiquette of bringing that up. And I could be an outlier, but I think there are a lot of desperately depressed teenagers who are very alone. And with the internet now, they can meet other people who share their interests and connect with them. And that's definitely causing some problems, and it's worth focusing on those problems.
Right.
But I noticed that Murray's attitude is basically, they would get over themselves and learn to relate to the normal people.
Right.
And, I spent a lot of time thinking about suicide. I wasn't content. I wasn't happy. I knew I wasn't happy. I realize people say, I can't do that sometimes when they mean I don't want to do that. But sometimes you literally can't do it.
It's true. It's very true.
That's at least one... It's one very salient reason why I tend to skew libertarian, is safety valves. The people who desperately need the thing.
Yes.
So, we, California banned plastic straws a while ago.
Right.
And I told my parents that it would be vastly better if they imposed like $100 per straw fine.
Yeah.
Because then if there's someone who really needs the straws, for some reason we haven't anticipated, because you can't anticipate
everything.
You have a safety valve.
Yeah.
And if you're right that nobody values a plastic straw at $100, then it's the same as the ban.
Right.
And you can... If people do buy the straws, you can use that to clean up and do net good with the environment.
Exactly. Really smart way to do it.
Yeah.
This reminds me of, so this is one thing in the book. This is the way I think things are a lot better. And perhaps this is something you're getting at, is like in 1960, on any given Thursday, a third of the population was watching the same TV show.
Yes.
Like at the same time, like holy mackerel. Can you imagine? And like, there's a lot of things like what could go on TV was very restricted. Norms were much more restrictive. Like we talk about like cancel culture today, but like if you were gay, you could not be publicly gay and be in like any kind of position of power or anything like that. And like you said, like if you grew up in a small town, you were there was no safety valve. Yeah. Like you have to make friends with the football team, or like you can't connect with other people that let's say you have X interest that's not served by being in a bit small town. Like I don't know, like being like reading Scott's blog. Like there would be no one else. I mean, how many people in the Triangle read Scott's blog? Well, at least come to the meetup. There's probably like 10 people. Yeah. Factor that, maybe there's 100 that read it total, right? Like I don't know.
I don't know about you. I use the blog to filter for people who have ineffable personal qualities that I'm going to get along with. And some effable physical qualities. I mean, there's decoupling. There's being interested in abstract ideas. There's trying to accurately make predictions and noticing when you're wrong. Right. Those are all mental habits that I've managed to F, but there's some remaining ineffability about it. Right.
So I guess there is like a hard like there are real trade-offs.
I think I guess what I was trying to say and doing a bad job of is that it depends on who's in what bucket. Murray, it reads like he's treating it as it's inconvenient that the nerds have to connect with the football team. I'm very well aware that there exist nerds who simply will not be able to connect with the football team.
Gotcha.
And if there are lots and lots of nerds like that, then that matters a lot. If they're extremely rare outliers, then it's distracting to bring you out because, somebody gets struck by lightning twice.
Gotcha.
So the goodness or badness depends on what funges against what, I guess.
Right. Is it something like where there's some people that can't are unable to fit into the mold, connect with whatever, just go along with it. And if you don't have any way that they can escape, it just doesn't work. It's not like always this thing where you could just figure it out. And
I found a book by Bertrand Russell when I was 16, and I read lots of his art essays. He had that quality. I related to him. And I learned later that he'd spent his teenage years the same way I had, utterly miserable and lonely and thinking a lot about, he says, that he used to go down and watch the sunset and think about committing suicide, but he didn't because he wanted to know more mathematics. Definitely not. I'm never endorsing everything anyone says, and that goes for him too, but he had that. So that was salient for me. And Scott mentions in a blog post that he got into philosophy when he bought a book by Bertrand Russell when he was 16.
Oh, that's awesome.
So there is a cluster here.
Yeah, absolutely.
But on the other hand, sometimes it's good for you to connect with the football team. Murray definitely, he has an argument that it impels you to do things you might not do yourself that you'll be better off having done. For me to say that doesn't happen because it didn't happen in my case, or treat the cases where it does happen as noise because it didn't happen in my case would be, epistemically really fucking questionable. Definitely don't want to do that.
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts here. I'm trying to think what's best. So we've had this, I think the football team's a good example.
Yeah.
Because I think it illustrates something real. So it seems like in 1960, the nerds stuck around.
Yeah.
They felt responsible to the football team. And, it's like Maytag, you live in the neighborhood, you take care of everybody. It seems like now, and perhaps there wasn't capability to do this, so this matters. Or perhaps things have gotten more libertarian in some sense, or so. I don't know. I'm hand waving right now, but I get the feeling like there's this ability to exit. We're going to exit to the big metropoles.
Yes.
We're going to leave. Every man for himself.
Yes. We're
going to do a lot better. And this plays out in the numbers. The upper class whites make a lot more money.
Yeah.
They stay married.
Yeah.
They have all these very socially conservative norms around child rearing, which they don't imprint on the football team, so to speak. Yeah. And people kind of are left behind.
Yes.
And it is much better for the upper class, but I think it is probably much worse.
Yeah.
In this great divergence.
Yep. There's the brain drain effects, and there's the lack of, intermediate role models. People who are sort of like you, but different enough that you can learn from them and modulate your behavior toward what they're doing.
Right. I think this in the context of Gerard, where if who are you imitating?
Yeah.
Who do you wish to be? And if you're imitating someone who's say the CEO of Maytag, he's responsible, lives in the neighborhood, he takes care of other people, he stays married to his wife, he does all these, raises his children, and he's responsible to the community. Maybe you try and live up to that. But if that person's gone, and not there,
consciously, and imitative instinct goes really deep.
Yeah.
This is maybe just a funny story, free association.
Yeah.
But definitely goes to Georgian mimesis. I was having this problem when I was in college where the spell checker on my home computer would show no problems. But I didn't have a printer at the time, so I would email it to the school's computers and print it off there.
Nice.
Their spell checker would show a bunch of problems.
Yeah.
And I eventually figured out that what was happening was that I sometimes slipped into using British spellings. And then I figured out that when I was doing that, my inner voice was imitating Bertrand Russell.
Oh, that's awesome.
I didn't even register that I was, but in almost all cases, a couple of times.
Right.
I think there was one point where I said, "This is a very peculiar argument," and then went into taking it apart. And there was
awesome.
but I totally hadn't, I wasn't even thinking. I wasn't thinking I'm imitating Bertrand Russell. It was just a tone of argument I picked up.
Isn't that awesome? Yeah, I do think, man, I think we very rarely have original ideas. I think a lot of what we do just copy our role models.
I think a lot of it is, can I float I'm not sure if it's a counter argument or a refactoring.
Oh, absolutely.
We don't have original ideas sui generis. We remix stuff. That's where original ideas come from. You can't create a new idea out of nothing. But we can't help but remix stuff because we're not perfect imitators.
So it's actually like so you think it's I find this super appealing. It's some like evolutionary argument, right? So you have like some kind of like a mutation or something when you try to copy.
I've been listening to a lot of J.J. Cale lately, the guitar player. Oh, yeah? And his guitar tone is really, it's noticeable. It's gorgeous. I really like it.
Yeah.
And I was reading about how he got that.
Yeah.
And he was trying to imitate Eric Clapton, maybe.
Gotcha.
But he couldn't figure out how Eric Clapton was doing it. So he ended up doing this whole separate thing.
Right.
And that's how we get that awesome guitar tone. Also, Black Sabbath, invented that loosely strung. The guitar tone there sounds really, really different.
Yeah.
And the way they did that was the guitarist lost part of his hand in an industrial accident, and that was the only way he could play. It was completely accidental. And you hear it in everything in metal after that point.
Right.
So mutation.
It's mutation. This may be just like, I don't know, just subconscious trying to signal something.
It's okay.
And I do think I think you're absolutely right. This happens a lot. But it almost sounds like it denies human agency.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly where I'm going with this. Do you think there is any place for human agency in this kind of thing? Or is it just like something, I don't know.
I think it depends on the cartoonist and media figure. Scott Adams wrote a book on systems versus goals, which I meant to read because the basic idea did sound, where he basically said that I didn't read it, so my brain is filling it in.
Yeah.
But what my brain fills in is that if you have a very particular picture of the way you want the world to look and you go chasing after that, you'll almost always fail because there are loads of ways to be wrong, to get that picture wrong. But if you have a sort of general direction and a bunch of heuristics, you can pretty consistently steer the future into a region higher in your preference ordering.
Gotcha. So
we have agency in that we can make the world a better place, but the more precise our goals become, the more helpless we are to achieve them just as they are specified.
Interesting. So the more specific we get, the harder it is.
Yeah. Sort of like the conjunction rule of probability. The more details you add, the more chances you have to be wrong.
Right, absolutely.
The more constraints you add, the higher the probability that you'll fail to satisfy some of them. But there are also unexpectedly good things that rank high in our preference ordering that we maybe didn't anticipate.
Yeah. Tell me if this is an example or not an example. We got two thoughts. So PayPal. So Peter Thiel, PayPal Mafia, they go through, they want to create like entire new currency, like digital currency, like Bitcoin. That's what they, like they're like the Fed's bad, like, like we love Rothbard. Like it's time, like torch the Fed. I actually don't know Rothbard's stance on the Fed, but I'm assuming he didn't like it. And we're gonna create this new currency, and they didn't quite accomplish that, but they end up creating this very valuable tech company.
Yeah.
Does that kind of fit into your systems goals?
Yeah, I think so. Or, well, sort of dual examples, except that I suspect they're in some sense the same example.
Yeah.
In Eliezer Yudkowsky's fictional story Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality.
Excellent plug here.
The character, it's a very good story.
It's a great story. Like Harry Potter, you got to check this out.
The character of Quirrell tells us that when he was younger, he wanted to be a Dark Lord, and he eventually gave up on it. But that if he could go back in time and stop himself from trying, he wouldn't do that because it caused him to do lots of research that was otherwise useful and make himself stronger. And so he was able to reorient that. And
nice.
Yudkowsky had a bunch of ideas about superintelligence that he ended up thinking were totally wrong. And I think I'm just going to say we're totally wrong. That it would be good by default, that we needed to create it as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And that impelled him to do lots of research and study cognitive science and biases, which ended up being very, very useful.
Right.
So there are some courses of actions where if they turn out to be mistaken, you'll probably get a lot of fringe benefits out of them. And
interesting.
I probably shouldn't even say fringe benefits. Maybe the capital you're going to desperately need for other stuff.
Right.
And then there are courses of action where if they fail, you're kind of screwed. My friend Danny is sort of a left-wing radical.
Oh, cool.
Or at least is socially a left-wing radical. And I've been having this half argument with him a lot, just in that if you burn the system to the ground and you're wrong that creates a better world, you are totally screwed.
Right.
So you need to build the better world first. And he kind of gets that, but
not quite.
Or he's not emphasizing it as much as I think he should. I mean, I shouldn't frame it so that I'm automatically right here.
Right. Yeah.
But it's crucial to think what will happen if you turn out to be badly wrong.
Right.
And take steps to mitigate that. And it's possible to misread that because, in general, the way you avoid being blamed for things in our society is inaction, not doing things. And so if people have this association that humility means not doing things because you're not sure it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But not doing things is also a choice, and sometimes it's exactly the wrong thing to do.
That's right. Yes, it very much is.
So I'd call humility, as opposed to modesty.
Right.
Is both less easy than that and less passive-coded.
Got it.
I got the humility-modesty distinction from Yudkowsky. If you hear someone you respect a lot is saying something that sounds clearly wrong, the modest thing to do is not to say anything about it, because who are you to think you could know better than them?
Right.
And usually the high humility course of action is to say so very loudly so you can be corrected, assuming you're wrong.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't necessarily assume that.
Right.
It's useful having a fact pattern where they give diametrically opposite answers. It lets you pull them apart pretty easily.
Definitely. Can get somewhere.
Yeah. So, Murray is saying, I think he's right, we're seeing this bifurcation.
Yeah.
Which kind of sucks for people on the bad end of the bifurcation.
Yeah. But it's pretty good for the people up top.
Yeah. At least in the short term. Probably in the long term, too. I went to college for a few years, and it wasn't at all what I thought it was. And when I talked to older people, what I thought it was going to be. It seems like that's sort of a recent development.
So what were your expectations going in? Like honest intellectual debate?
Yeah, a lot more like the rationalist community.
Right.
They were really in favor of diversity, which the reason you want diversity is so you have people with different views coming together and testing each other's theories. And,
right.
I mean, I knew they didn't just mean ideological diversity, but I assumed they wanted the other kinds as proxies for ideological. And no. And if I'm right, that's gotten worse. And that... See, I want to be very careful of the narrative that in the long run, it's bad for the upper class people too.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out downsides that you do get echo chambers, and the echo chambers make it more difficult to think, and that makes it more difficult to make decisions, and that is potentially a huge problem.
Yeah, just on the intellectual side, right?
Yeah.
And I think two thoughts here. I think your notion about college preps and universities changing over time, where they were much more truth seeking, things like that. Like, so the evidence I have that this perhaps is true is that like the $20 bill on the sidewalk, that there even is like this community of people, like the quote unquote rationalist community.
Yes.
Like even exists.
Yeah.
Perhaps is evidence that there's there's these essentially academic people outside of academia, like in a really robust way.
Yes.
Is evidence to me that.
Yeah, it does.
Things are weird.
There was this discussion on Less Wrong. I was reading between people. I was reading the transcript, and it was a voice chat. And they were talking about a bunch of stuff, but one thing they were talking about was why academic decision theories have not... I'm just going to go ahead and adopt my perspective because it's easier than the disclaimers. Have not got as far as Eliezer Yudkowsky has got.
Right.
I think his model actually is progress. And so why do we have decades of people working on this and no one in academia getting that far? I'm not sure his model is right, but it's closer to right than the academically. Right. And you could kind of tell that every time the conversation circled back to that, he got sort of impatient. And eventually he said that asking why academia didn't solve timeless decision theory is sort of like asking why J.C. Penney didn't solve timeless decision theory. That there was a point in the past where their incentives were aligned in a way that would produce results like that. Yeah. But we aren't in that world now, and we haven't been for a long time. Right. And we shouldn't be misled by the, big red letters on the side of the thing saying this is about truth-seeking. And I think he put it less inflammatorily than truth-seeking, that very last bit. Right. And Scott said recently that, in 2014, this is very close to an exact quote. In 2014, if you and your friends were being the experts, that was awesome and you should celebrate. And in 2021, if you and your friends are being the experts, that's just getting kind of sad now. Are the experts okay? Do they need help? And, he's joking out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, what is going on?
Yeah. I think partly simulacra levels. That was the first two we did. I helped interviews V, and then you and I talked about that.
That was a lot of fun.
I think that's a big piece of it. It wouldn't be happening on its own, but so it's not the root of the problem. And I'm not sure that I have a good enough model. It could be several things that we have lumped together as one thing. Right. Partly it's good-hearting. That we're getting very good at optimizing for the measures, getting very good at optimizing for the legible targets. And that's increasing the gap between what we're optimizing for and what we really want. So, and you're... Goodhart's law, where when you set something as a measure, it ceases to be. Yeah, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And when I explain this to my parents, I talk about the Soviets paying factories for how many shoes they put out, and the factories releasing very tiny shoes, or paying truck factories for how many tons of machineries they put out, and suddenly you get very, very heavy trucks. Right, exactly. In my experience, there's it's a frustrating thing to talk about because people always feel like if they just add one more sentence to it, they will have specified what they want. We just have to say no heavy trucks. Okay, not per shoe. They keep thinking that it's just one more sentence away, and then you poke holes in that, and they add another sentence, and you poke holes in that. And it's frustrating because a lot of the times the argument ends with them feeling like, well, obviously smart people can work this one out. And, I mean, I oftentimes think that in theory it's possible, but in practice it's very unlikely. I call that a Lewis argument. The philosopher Daniel Lewis once said in exasperation, well, I cannot refute an incredulous stare. And the Lewis argument is an argument where people don't actually have any counter arguments at the end of it, but they still feel like you're wrong. And, you know, it's frustrating because that instinct could be you don't want to disregard it out of hand. But I do prefer things I can argue with.
I think it's more productive. So the long term. Up class. You know, do you know what I see?
What?
I see it pretty vividly with nothing changing. It's something like South Africa at this point. You know, where if you've done well, you know, you get this house with this, you know, barbed wire, electric fence, you know, bars in the windows, you hire private security. You just, you know, it's all this like just super insulated, you know.
No social trust.
No, absolutely no social trust. And I just don't see, you know, like, how do you get out of it?
I wish I knew more history. Trust comes from somewhere. Scott has that post on niceness, community, and civilization, and trust networks spontaneously forming. And the Americans and the Germans, or maybe the British and the Germans in World War I getting out of the trenches on Christmas. So there is a trick to it. Maybe a lot of tricks to it, but I wish I knew what they were. Curiosity? I mean, this might just be vague moralizing, but I feel like I'm going to discard the false humility. I think I'm in the top 10 percentage points for people who've had productive dialogues with people who are on the opposite side politically for just about any side you can specify, any issue you can specify. And I didn't get there by thinking, assuming it's an accomplishment to be there, which I am going, by thinking that I ought to. Or that it would be virtuous. I got there because I was curious. A lot of the times I was as curious about people's psychology. I mean, it's not something you would say to their face, but you're wondering, okay, how does this person get that badly wrong? But it's still curiosity, so you still want to hear from them. So if you don't say exactly that and you signal friendliness and openness, they will try to explain to you and you'll learn things. And I think Nietzsche said the best way to loving your enemies is to learn from them because it makes you grateful to them, which does help. But I don't think that scales.
And it also doesn't seem like it's correlated with having more smart people. But it's definitely not the only thing. I mean, there's plenty of places, you know, Singapore's maybe not a great example, but, you know, China or like places that have plenty of smart people that are unable to.
Partly it's the technology. Going back to Graham, Graham says technology is a lever that magnifies human action, but also human capability. Technology increases the returns to intelligence. And social technology, you know, kind of fits in there. Having the structures in place that let you turn the intelligence into results. And norms, which, I mean, probably falls under social technology. But, cowboys, you know, having a culture where being kind of a maverick and considering unusual ideas and taking action when it seems like action is necessary and no one else is doing it. In some cultures, that's a good thing. And in some cultures, it's not. I guess it would be like 12, 14 years ago now, so it's probably out of date. But I remember Yudkowsky saying that the reason we didn't see more superpoweredness coming out of Asia was that they have this cultural norm that the nail that sticks up is the one that gets hammered down.
Right.
And that, I'm sort of filling this in, that does have benefits. It lets you run normal society really well, but it limits your ability to access outliers. Scott's recent post on the CDC, on the FDA, Freudian slip there. One of his arguments was that a disproportionate amount of the value from approving things is a handful of extremely high-value innovations. And so if your screening process stops those anti-HIV drugs and COVID vaccines, then even if it works very well, in most cases, it's still massively net negative.
Right. Well, and especially thinking like, most drugs, there are very few drugs that provide most of the benefit to humanity. It's like antibiotics, like penicillin, and it's some huge percentage, and then everything else down behind that, right? Like,
yes.
And so if you lop one off, that's really important. It could be half, 80% of like the entire benefit to humanity.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so hard to reason about those. I remember Paul Graham saying how he was calling what he did with Y Combinator black swan farming.
Interesting.
He was saying how the vast majority of his return is on those very rare investments that pay disproportionately well. And so that requires him to do lots of counterintuitive things. And he said that sometimes he doesn't do the counterintuitive things that he can't bring himself to. Benjamin Hoffman criticized him a lot for that. And may have had a good point. But I'm going to sail past that. That if you have a business in front of you that is probably going to be profitable, and another one that's almost certainly not going to be, but might be insanely, incredibly profitable, then it's weird to fund the second business, knowing that you're almost certainly going to regret.
Say it again. So if you're talking about fund, you fund the one with the incredibly high upside.
The business model he was describing was almost all of the value is in outliers, almost all of the outliers are very low probability.
Right.
And so you take actions that you think will be futile, almost certainly.
Right.
Because they might not be.
Right.
And that requires you to pass up actions that you think would probably be useful to some degree.
Right.
But have a lower chance of being insanely, incredibly useful.
Gotcha. So in other words, like if you're Paul Graham, you're Y Combinator, you want to, or, you get venture capital.
Yeah, you want to fund Airbnb. And the problem with funding Airbnb is it's obvious that no one wants to sleep in an air mattress in someone else's living room. It's a stupid idea. Right. And he says that consistently, the really big ones seemed like stupid ideas. Right. They seemed lame. It wasn't just that nobody saw the value, it was that they were dumb looking. And that dumbness kept people from seeing the value. Right.
Well, it's interesting. So I started doing some angel scouting for Sahil. He's he started Gumroad. He's a big kind of like entrepreneur, VC angel investor. And it's interesting, in hearing from him, it's like Yudkowsky calls this it's like the red hair problem or something, is an inadequate equilibria. I'm saying it's wrong, but if like if no one funds entrepreneurs with red hair, and you find this really good deal, like this is the next Airbnb. This is the Airbnb. They're going to be able to solve like the liquidity problem. People are actually going to and that liquidity problem for like spaces for these fake hotel rooms in people's houses, and people are actually going to sleep on an air mattress in people's house, strangers' houses. Then even if you fund them, they'll never be able to get a Series B or C because no one else funds red-haired entrepreneurs. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see it. I wish I remembered. I thought I had that one just about memorized.
Yeah.
Zvi has a series of essays that make a similar point. I can use that. But if you think of which one it is, send it to me.
And it might not have been Inadequate Equilibrium. It might have been one
for
other series.
A number of months, probably a year and a half after I thought I had read everything Yudkowsky had written, I'd keep finding other essays that just weren't, compiled into the course sequences.
Right.
So if you do stumble across it, I might not have read that one, and I'd like to.
Absolutely.
I do tend to find the people I like and then go very deep on them.
That's wise.
It's
almost a black swan thing, right? Where I think, you're looking for the outliers of insight.
I think it's how my brain works to a large degree. Like, I figured out, it was really funny when I was a kid and a teenager. There were a lot of jokes about it that I had great difficulty reading strangers' body language, and my parents thought I was psychic because I could read theirs very well. Very, very, very well. And I eventually figured out that it's a sensitivity versus specificity trade-off. Gotcha. That I had memorized all of their micro-expressions perfectly.
Right.
And my brain couldn't generalize that to other people's non-micro expressions.
Nice.
That if you have a very precise picture of that exact frown in your head, the precision of that picture itself keeps you from abstracting it into something you can recognize on someone else's face.
Nice.
So I think to some extent I'm just sort of wired to model a few people in great, great depth. And it sort of fits my, where I tend to land on I don't intuitively grok patriotism. I don't have a deep concern for my fellow countrymen. I'm not more altruistic, so it's not that I care more about foreigners. It's like all of the sort of second-order loyalty goes into the very specific people that I'm focused on.
Gotcha.
And that's less true than it used to be because rationalist community. But,
right. A little bit broader.
Yeah. That was a tangent, but...
No, that's good. That also reminds me, it's like, I feel like just about everybody in the rationalist community, pretty utilitarian, right? Like,
yeah. I think a lot of them are... I've thought about this. A lot of them aren't utilitarian, but they bite bullets that usually only utilitarians bite.
I think
they're definitely in that cluster. But I used to get frustrated with people accuse David Friedman of being a utilitarian, and he's literally written an essay called Why I Am Not a Utilitarian. They accuse Scott of being a utilitarian. He's wrote that whole series of essays about where he's starting to have doubts about utilitarianism, and then he amends his moral system and ends up with what he calls contractarianism, which is... My philosophy professor I liked at school had not heard that word before, and he seems to have made it up. So I think, there are definitely more utilitarians than most movements, but I also think there are a lot of people who are utilitarian adjacent in some sense.
That's right.
But have also explained in great detail why they're not exactly utilitarians.
Right.
It's interesting. Anyway, you were going somewhere with that. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I want you to keep expanding that, but it's just in the context of the football team.
Yeah.
I think this is a great metaphor. So in the context of the football team, I think most of the football team would be much more partial to like some kind of virtue ethics or something like that. Whereas I think perhaps smarter people are more utilitarian in general.
Reading Bertrand Russell as a teenager, he was a utilitarian and I wasn't. And I decided I thought he was biased in favor of it because it enables analysis. As opposed to deontology.
Right.
Sometimes it's useful to say things without necessarily endorsing them.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to say, I think the dominant ethical stance in the rationalist community is virtue ethicist who believes that it is virtuous to approximate utilitarianism. But the mental processes are very... that a good person would do this.
Right.
And so you get behavior that looks utilitarian, but the underlying mental schema is very virtue ethics.
Yeah, I think that's very wise way to put it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lewandowski once tweeted, let me get this right, the rules say we have to use utilitarianism, but all the good people are deontologists, and virtue ethics is what actually works.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. That's awesome.
I also like Stephen K. said something about deontology, virtue ethics, and consequentialism being analogous to virtue ethics was nouns and consequentialism was verbs, and I think deontology, what was it, adjectives?
I could definitely see that.
I do see them sometimes as different elements that come together to enact the mental schema we actually use. I have to try hard to avoid teleological language. Right. It would be wrong to say different elements that we use in order to, because the only reason we think that's a goal is because it's the goal that we have.
Right.
But I do see them as, to a large extent, complementary in practice and not in theory, which is fun.
Yeah, that's wise, right? That's a good point. So like we use all these different tools in our day-to-day lives. Sometimes you do this cost benefit analysis. Sometimes you do things because they're right. Sometimes there's all, and it's very case dependent. And the world's complicated. Yeah, and we end up using them all in all these different cases.
I think I'm also biased in favor of utilitarianism because it's fun to figure out utilitarian justifications for the rules I already had. But the utilitarianism isn't the cause of the rules, except maybe in a very loose cultural evolutionary sense.
Right. I think that makes sense. I'm just noodling on that.
Yeah. I really like I was listening to one of these with my dad, and I really like the pauses to think. You don't hear a lot of that, and it's good to listen to. I mean, sometimes a listener needs the pauses to think.
Yeah, to actually consume, especially when things are high density.
Yeah.
So I guess coming back to our original thought, just this kind of divergence. This divergence between upper class, white America, and then, lower class, white America. Just quantifying that, perhaps just to bring it full circle, like marriage rates, it used to be that everyone got married.
Yes.
It's like if you had a child, you went and you got married. Yes. Shotgun wedding, this is what you did.
Yes.
Happened to a lot of people. Everyone did this. It's norm.
Exceptions are notable.
And
disproportionately concentrated among people who are knowable for other reasons.
Right.
I noticed it reading about philosophers. I forget exactly which period, but there is some period where every knowable philosopher you read about never married, and that was very odd, and people talked about it.
Right.
I don't know if that... I'm not really suggesting a deep connection. I would guess that if you're wired differently than the surrounding culture, you have to do some of your own thinking, and that builds some good habits, maybe.
Right. Do you... Murray seems convinced of this. I think I'm convinced of this, but I haven't articulated it well, so I want to throw this out there, and maybe we can sort this out.
I'm honored.
Marriage as a social institution.
Yeah.
Do you think it's as important as Murray says it is?
I think it solves some problems that desperately need solving. I guess I'm not all the way convinced that the solution is unique, but I'm not convinced that it's not unique either. One thing I like about you is I can relate uncertainty without it being taken as like active suspicion.
Right.
Figuring out that there was no other way to achieve that seems like it would take a lot of thought, but I don't have another way in mind.
Right. And what are some of those things you think? Is it like some long-term expectation, like so you can play like some repeated game?
Well, it does several things. I'm going to start with probably not the most important one, but the easiest to articulate.
Yeah.
In keeping with our theme.
Nice. Exactly.
That it,
we do what we can here.
Keeps people from unilaterally altering the contract after other people have paid sunk costs. That if you take a job and move to a new city and get a new apartment, maybe 6 months later, the people who hired you say, well, if you were willing to do it for $200,000 a year before, now that you've paid all these costs that you can't get back, you'd surely be willing to do it for $50,000. And, humans have a evolutionary, I think, instinct to say no and fuck you.
Right, exactly.
It's the dictator game, which helps us in repeated games. Marriage locks down, sort of freezes the commitment that keeps people from trying to alter it for their own advantage, which in turn keeps us from having to pay the costs of people trying to alter it. Sort of like private property is economically... Punishing thieves is economically efficient because working as a thief is still work, and the net profit is just a transfer. And we don't want people... I hear that from David Friedman. That at first glance it seems like stealing isn't necessarily economically inefficient because you're just transferring stuff. And then it turns out that we want to disincentivize thieves from going to the effort of stealing stuff. Right. Because, so similarly, we want to when you're in a relationship and you're trying to figure out what you can get and push that to the limit, it's a very different mentality. Yeah. I think it's not a very pleasant mentality to be in.
Right.
And it's costly. It also solves some evolutionary stuff because of what we're sort of... I also got this from David Friedman, that basically sleeping around and hypergamy, that
having a lot of partners.
Yeah, also for men having a lot of partners, for women trading up for someone higher status. I think I'm representing Friedman accurately here, and I'm pretty confident he wouldn't be. I'm not badly wrong enough that he'd be offended. That men and women, on average, as groups, defect in different ways. That the shape of, not necessarily what we want, but what we want when we're wanting the wrong thing is mismatched. And it's mismatched in a way that creates some problems with respect to time. Sometimes a man trades up for a younger model. Sometimes a woman trades up for someone with more status. These are all, generalizations. Yeah. And they're all, how weak those are when it comes to individuals, but it also, if you really look at the evolutionary stuff, it's hard to see how there wouldn't be some of that happening.
Yeah.
Some marriages also sort of a brace against that. If you marry a girl when she's 20, the marriage is a way that she can be confident that you're not going to dump her when she's 40.
Right.
And David Friedman talks about the rings, the diamonds, and how those sort of came into existence as a social custom, as a bond to a sort of security deposit that you weren't going to engage in theft of virginity.
Right. So she can go keep the ring and go sell it. And
yeah, that
worst comes to
damages her dating market value if you don't want to stay with her.
Right.
And like all signaling things, you wish there was a way to do that without having to spend a lot of money on the hunk of stone that,
right.
costly signaling.
Right.
But sometimes there isn't.
Yeah. It's the best we can do.
So, marriage. Also the kids. I mean, Murray gets into that. The parents who are married seem to have the best results in terms of their kids staying out of prison and not getting a drug habit and not suffering a number of other legible bad fates.
Right.
There's a lot of evidence for that, and you have to figure it's pretty significant because we all start as kids. I mean, the number of affected people is just huge.
Right. And I guess when I think through why that might be, it might be good in that respect. It's something like, there's two people who are, they're kind of locked together.
Yeah.
And they've got this and it's protecting their downside.
Yes.
In some sense that, your wife's not going to try and leave you for some higher status person.
Yes.
And your wife's protected because as she gets older, you're not going to go leave her for some younger lady or something like that. And this is a heterosexual case, but
Friedman, I'm not relaying it very well. Friedman phrased it in terms of male peak performance and female peak performance on the dating market are asymmetrically timed.
Interesting.
Men value youth. That's early in the relation. Again, generalization. But, and women value status and financial success, which tend to take time to acquire.
Right.
And so you have people whose value on the dating market is going to fluctuate and the man is going to gain more opportunities. The woman is going to lose more opportunities. This fits pretty well the cultural wisdom of, you knock a woman up and leave her, damaged or whatever. I used to be really puzzled by that because, why is she damaged?
It does make sense.
But it makes some sense now. There was something else, and it seemed it alters. Oh, right. Murray establishes that you don't get the same benefits to the children with parents who are merely cohabiting. But I thought he didn't
go into that enough.
Yeah, he didn't spend enough time. It could really just be a selection effect.
Right.
I'm not saying I think it is, but who decides to get married is non-random.
Yeah.
So I think Scott had a metaphor at one point about something completely else, but good metaphors get where he said he was talking about AA, and he said, imagine the alternate world where it doesn't work at all. It doesn't help at all, but it's the conventional wisdom that if you're really serious about quitting drinking, you'll go to AA. We will see that people who go to AA are much more likely to quit drinking than people who don't, because anyone who is very serious about it will do this useless thing.
Right.
Similarly, I can't believe that selection effects aren't part of what's going on here.
Right.
I would be surprised if they were all of what's going on here.
Yeah. And I think it's probably, if I had to guess, selection effects, and then it's the fact you kind of like, it produces this longer term orientation.
Yeah. It alters the mentality.
Yeah.
In a way that, you can do stuff.
Yeah.
You couldn't do with the other mentality.
Yeah. It almost gives you some slack, right?
Yeah.
When you're not just optimizing for the short term all the time.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. It gives you some slack. It means you don't have to hit the legible metrics. You can experiment more.
Right.
I'm thinking of Zvi's stuff about moral mazes. I'm not used to thinking of marriages as moral mazes, but...
It can be a moral maze.
Yeah.
There's been this big decline in this institution. And one of the things out of the book I found is I wish I had this statistic in front of me, but it was divorce rates among, quote unquote upper class whites, just like astronomically lower. Yeah. Like, they're like, oh, half of people get divorced, but like among, the leftist, tankies say, what are they, professional managerial class, however you want to put this, it's just much lower.
Yes. I've seen that statistic too. Or I've seen a statistic that produced the same reaction, so I'm guessing it's the same statistic.
Yeah. Maybe it was 20%.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a big swing.
Yeah.
A big swing. Pretty weird.
It's partly why Murray has it formatted in terms of what the upper class say and what the upper class do.
Right. So they say... So what do they say? Perhaps we can establish that.
I'm thinking of, I heard someone on the internet, someone sort of disreputable in some other contexts, so I'm not gonna, but who sometimes had some good ideas. But I didn't completely trust him, so I remember he made the point that he refactored the sexual revolution as high IQ people who can handle that, gutting the institutions that low IQ people use to get by. That if you have a 130 IQ and you are a stable professional managerial type person, polyamory is probably fine for you.
You probably make it work.
Really bad if it becomes a norm, because if it becomes a normal thing, because most people are not going to be able to make it work.
Right.
Although that does raise the question of whether, the in-group siloing might actually be, I'm not sure good in this instance, but good theoretically. If we have a way to signal these are the people who can make polyamory work, and the signal was reasonably accurate, we might be able to have different sets of norms.
Right.
I'm libertarian enough that it makes me sad to think that there might be people who are better off being polyamorous who don't get to do that because most people can't handle being polyamorous.
Right. That kind of sucks.
Yeah, it makes me sad. I would like to find a way around that if I could.
People kind of do what they want.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is interesting. And I wonder how that feels. The guy I was reading was, a very right-wing and very conflict theorist, and he was framing it as sort of maybe not quite deliberate sabotage, but something like that. And I wonder, I don't think it's that. So I wonder how it feels if the behaviors you actually use, the code you follow in your actions is very sort of conservative and traditional.
Yes.
And your stated doctrines are very radical. I just wonder, does it feel like at each point the traditional thing is just the thing that makes sense, but you don't generalize it to other people? Or do you think that you're in special circumstances but other people aren't? Or are you communicating at a high simulacra level, so when you say the radical stuff, do you process that as a coalitional signal rather than a... Just wonder.
It's probably that, right?
Yeah.
Probably the last one a lot, and then all the other ones as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just weird. It's like, so, upper class whites, wealthier than they ever have been, they get married, similar rights to that they did in 1960. A lot of parental investment in their kids. They go to church a lot. They, they're involved in their communities. Their PTAs are quite vibrant. There's all these things. There's not the drug and alcohol problems that exist in with lower class whites, and it's weird, right?
Yeah.
So there's all these really socially conservative practices.
Yeah.
But there's no expectation that anyone lives up to that.
Yeah.
Or you would never advertise it, to think I remember there's a cover of Newsweek, used to read Newsweek when it was still a magazine when I was like, in high school. And, it's like, there's something about, how marriage wasn't really important or something. Like we shouldn't imprint like family values or something like that. But upper class whites are incredibly into family values.
Yeah.
Like this is their thing, man.
Yeah.
But they don't want anyone else to have to follow it, which I think is, in some sense, is good not to trap people, right?
Yeah.
But then again, there is a strong norm. It's like a silent norm, right? You can't talk about it. It's so weird. It's so weird.
That's a good candidate for, if we're doing, I always forget, it's hamartiology. If we're looking for the place where evil enters the world, my guess is that it will have something to do with the can't talk about it thing. Not because talking about things automatically makes everything better, but because that kind of sort of cone of silence tends to systematically make things worse.
Yes. Or even at some level, if you can't correctly identify what's going on, you can never have any hope of fixing it.
Can't think in public. Can't speak in public. Kantorovics write their nice letters to Stalin and get shipped off.
Yep.
I mean, he didn't, but somebody hid the letter.
Yeah.
Which in turn means you don't get the Kantorovics, who are socially clueless, but oftentimes not clueless about our stuff.
Right. And it's a real problem now, I see, because, all these things are right affiliated.
Yeah.
And most upper class whites are, center left,
I read this blogger saying we have to credit Joe Biden with the vaccine, because if Trump had won re-election, he would have endorsed the vaccine, and that would have meant that we wouldn't be able to use it. It would be too dangerous.
It would be too dangerous. Cuomo talked about that quite a bit. This is the Trump vaccine. They rushed it through. There's no way we can trust it.
Yes.
Now that's flipped around. Now the far right won't take the vaccine. It's quite entertaining. Scary, but entertaining nonetheless. Some level.
I'm learning from it. So that's a good sign.
Yeah.
I agree it's scary. I do think I'm starting to maybe get a handle on it. And that's an anti-scary feeling.
That's good.
It's less confusing.
What I do worry is, without kind of radical action advancement on the technology front, if we continue to have like really sluggish, stagnant growth, maybe there's a little bit, but not that much, or maybe there's even zero in worst case, or negative. It makes the political much more important because it's divvying up what's left, and then these things get even worse.
Yeah,
and you can't have someone on the left saying family values are really important and like we want everyone to get married and like you just can't do that.
No. And shifts people into that mentality suited to zero-sum conflicts, which is a very bad thing if you want to get out of the overall situation.
Right.
I think Brett Weinstein has said some stuff about the Nazis and that being downstream of the fact that they were seeing economic contraction. And he thinks there might be a evolutionary program to look for other groups and take their stuff when you're seeing economic contraction.
Because that's the only real option. Or it's a
we think it's the only.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's a very, very legible option.
Yeah.
Right?
In the ancestral environment it would have been.
Right.
So that part is really scary. The stuff with the vaccine is the anti-vaxxers, it's less scary to me because it's hard to take them seriously. I see them as functioning at a high simulacra level rather than modeling physical reality. That's going to work out bad for them in situations where physical reality matters, but it also feels like it should limit their ability to directly hurt me and the people I care about.
Right. But perhaps it's a testament to how I'm not sure about this word, but how virtual the political fight has gotten in some sense. It's like really not real at all. It's all on Twitter. And so it almost feels like the anti-vaxxers, they can't even get past the fact that like this could be in the physical environment, right? Yeah. Like this could be the real thing in the real world.
Yes.
Because everything else is operating on that just kind of almost imaginary level where simulacra level.
I remember. See, I don't know. I could just be reiterating what you just said, or this might be obvious, but it clicked something for me. The comment section at Slate Star Codex, somebody made a bad argument that we didn't need to worry about AI again, and Scott took it apart into little tiny pieces again. The last of those he posted, I think it was actually titled Contra Ace McGlue. Oh God, are we doing this again?
Yeah.
Which is not to. I think I have the idea that we might disagree about that, so I want to specify that the fact that those people are making bad arguments isn't even evidence that there aren't good arguments. I'm not saying they were making bad arguments because they were arguing against them. I'm saying they were.
Yeah.
And someone on the comment section said, well, they're humanities people. Think about it. Look at AI. It's huge. It's civilization altering. It's very abstract. It's just obviously symbolic. You don't need to say it's symbolic. They process it like they would a literary trope because it's so obviously the stuff that literary tropes are made of.
Right.
And it doesn't occur to them to think, wait, do the actual laws of physics let us do that?
Right. Exactly.
And I think that was what was happening. And I think I see it happening in other areas. Maybe just going over simulacra levels again.
Yeah. And you mentioned this just a while ago, but at perhaps the very real level with AI risk, I do think AI risk is a very important question to be worried about, concerned about. I think it gets more airtime than other X risks. Yeah. Which is somewhat, and I wonder if that's just because there's a lot of computer science people or something, and that's their area. And I also think, so it's weird, right? I'm not worried about AI. I'm much less worried about AI taking our jobs than I am AI killing us.
Same. Strong agreement.
But I'm also worried about, damping progress because we're worried about AI risk.
Yes.
When it's one of the few areas where we can still do anything.
Yes. I got that. And I can uncaveatedly affirm that it's a legitimate thing to worry about.
Yeah.
I mean, if it turns out that we ought to have stalled progress, that doesn't get us out of that downside.
Right.
Yeah, I would worry about that a lot. And definitely more worried about killing us than I am at taking our jobs. And I do, if I contrast it with, my brain is pretty min-maxed. There's stuff I'm very good at and stuff I'm very bad at.
Mine too.
The climate science stuff is, I always feel like it's chemistry. It's oriented towards some aspect that I really, really suck at.
Yeah.
I have very little ability to evaluate those arguments themselves.
Yeah.
Gases, and my brain doesn't do that well. It does do the stuff relating to AI well, so I tend to focus more on that because I can actually have non-meta level ideas about it.
Yeah.
And that holds, I think, also for viruses and also for really a lot of X risk.
Right.
My brain does philosophy of science really well. It does epistemology really well. It doesn't usually do actual scientific content really well.
Right.
Like earth science or...
Yeah.
So definitely, disproportionate focus there.
And we've also, I just look at, say we talked about cowboys earlier.
Yeah.
And, when we tested one of the first atomic bombs, the physicists that were working on it, and they're really smart people, but they believed there was some percentage chance that when they tested it, it would light the atmosphere on fire and kill everyone.
Yeah.
They weren't sure, and they still did it.
Yeah.
Oh man, I don't know. And that's probably not a good attitude. Like the question is, with all these things, it's like, what is the acceptable level of risk?
I wonder. See, my brain generates an explanation for that. I don't want to uncritically endorse it, but
yeah,
my dad knew this guy. I think it was when he was in the National Guard. It may have been after he was in the National Guard, and the guy was also in the military.
Yeah.
Not that he was in the National Guard, so they wouldn't send him to Vietnam.
Nice.
This guy was in the actual military, and my dad knew some stuff about his background, and he talked about the juxtaposition between this guy was very fearless in terms of, charging enemy machine gun people.
Oh, yeah?
And he was utterly incapable of saying no to anyone in authority.
Oh, yeah?
And those were all sort of orthogonal. He had a very strong need for approval. So the thing I would wonder about with the scientists is, maybe it was just too awkward for them not to do it. I mean...
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Do we think that's a trade-off they actually decided to make, or as opposed to they should have... I'm wondering if they weren't bowing to social incentives rather than bravely experimenting. I would not have this worry if there were one scientist working alone in a lab.
Right. I think, it's probably some calculus where you look at it and you're like, well, we don't think the risk is that high. And there's immense social pressure because, the Army brought us to New Mexico and they got us and our families in these barracks. And, General Groves is like, he wants the bomb now, to end this war. And you just calculate that all together and okay, we have to do this. I don't know.
My brain thinks that's more likely than them deciding it was okay that there was a 5% chance of lighting the atmosphere on fire.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that perhaps a better explanation. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. A lot of layers to it.
A lot of layers to it. Well, Quinn, we've covered quite a lot today.
We have. I think this was a good one.
Yeah, I think we got a lot of productive ground covered. I learned a lot.
Me too.
Any other closing thoughts you can think of before?
I don't think so. I never have closing thoughts ready.
Yeah. But I think if I had to sum it up, in some real way, things have gotten worse or have not really gotten better for some people. And we should think about what we can do to mitigate that. Or, well, one more thought for you. Do you think things being flat is a good in themselves? Good in itself? So things being flat is in having moderate distance between, someone who just, works in retail and Jeff Bezos. Do you think there's some good in that?
Those are two different questions. I think there are some people who think it's good in itself, and I'm not one of those people. I think there are sometimes, maybe even often, utilitarian type reasons why it's instrumentally good, and diminishing marginal utility of money, for instance, which provides some historical context for where the instinct came from.
Right.
I'm not dismissing it because all our instincts come from something like that. But no, I was trying to figure out how to condense my politics to explain it to people at college. I used to say I was anti-poverty but not anti-inequality. So potentially open to taking away rich people's money to give it to poor people, but very uninterested in taking it away to chuck it into a hole in the ground.
Right.
And I think that is a difference in perspective, because I think for some people, taking away from the rich people is not it doesn't go on the con side of the ledger. It's not a price you pay to do something else. But I could definitely be convinced instrumentally, and I might have to accept that if other people have strong enough egalitarian impulses, then they may be experiencing enough suffering that I'm utilitarian enough that I have to sort of bow to that, but I'm not sure yet. And I'm not I'm using utilitarian as a adjective, never identified as one,
right?
Because I don't buy all the bullets.
Yeah. I will say this. I have this moral intuition.
Yeah.
So the nicest car you can get in inflation adjusted terms in the US, like essentially the nicest car you could reasonably get, was $47,000, $47,500, like some Cadillac or something like that. And I don't know. Perhaps it's some like Quaker background or something, but I do have this preference for like ostentatious displays of wealth and things like that. I think are not good for anyone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I have multiple justifications for why those are not good. They're often, I don't want to say explicitly, but not too implicitly, a deliberate attempt to incite envy or create.
Right, yeah. Like I think that's just kind of
so
wrong.
That falls under people trying to hurt other people.
Yeah, exactly. I very much feel that, right?
And the baseline is sort of, that it's costly. Even if you don't have that, it's costly signaling that's not going to value. A lot of the times when I think about inequality and I think about not being opposed to it, I think in terms of maybe there's someone who really needs that car. I can't think why that would be, but my imagination is very limited. So that's the argument I go to.
Kind of like plastic straws, right?
What?
It's like the plastic.
Oh, yeah,
straw,
exactly. Like I was
maybe just like really.
No, the conspicuous consumption stuff is socially negative sum. It would be socially negative sum even if people's weren't optimizing to cause negative emotional consequences in other people. It's one thing to sort of shrug off those consequences when they aren't deliberately intended. It's another thing when they're the whole point and the behavior doesn't make any sense without them.
Yeah.
No, I'm definitely with you there.
Gotcha. And that's kind of it. That is separate. It's separate from the inequality question, I think.
Yeah.
I think it is separate.
I think some people, again, it's propaganda. It's the propaganda you use on yourself. So it's not necessarily dishonest propaganda. But Bertrand Russell, that same essay where he's talking about motivations, he starts with acquisitiveness. And his stock example of acquisitiveness is I'm forgetting the name of the country. Middle Eastern, I'm pretty sure. Little girls who came to live with his family when he was a teenager.
Yeah.
And they had almost starved. And with his family, they obviously had enough to eat. But they spent all their time stealing fruit from the surrounding farms and burying it. Because, anyway, that is the, to incite sympathy for people who really want a lot of money. I think he explicitly uses that to set up why someone thinks they need $10 billion. I'm sure it's not the only reason, but I'm not even sure it's the most common reason.
Right.
And he says stronger than acquisitiveness is rivalry, and brings up a lot of examples of people hurting themselves to hurt their rivals more.
Oh,
and
nice.
then he says love of glory tends to be a little stronger than rivalry, but it's hard. And love of power is rarer than love of glory, but it's much stronger in the people who have it. And it has an outside historical impact because people who love power tend to end up with a lot of power.
Yeah.
It was a good essay.
It's a great essay. I got to read it.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, that'll be good.
I always wish I had a solution at the end of these.
Yeah. We always end up with more questions. But, perhaps, describing the problem as best we can is that's the beginning.
Scratches my itch for meaning.
Absolutely.
In good company.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. Well, Quinn, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
We'll do it again soon. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives.